Good afternoon. My name is Cindy Buys, and I am the past chair and current board member of the Southern Illinois chapter of the United Nations Association. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this 75th anniversary celebration for the United Nations. We have a fantastic program planned for you today. I would like to begin by taking a moment to thank the Carbondale Public Library for hosting this program today, and also to thank our co-sponsors, the Carbondale branch of the AAUW and the UNA RSO at Southern Illinois University Carbondale. Before turning the program over to our speakers today, I also want to take a moment to say a few words about why we should care about the work of the United Nations. When you fly on a plane to visit another country, order a product online to be shipped from another country, make an international phone call, or mail a letter to a friend or a relative in another country, you can thank the work of the United Nations in creating the infrastructure that makes these and many other international transactions possible. The United Nations has the largest and most comprehensive membership of any international body, consisting of 193 member states. No member has ever left the United Nations. Thus, only the United Nations can claim that it truly represents the entire spectrum of the international community. For that reason, when transnational problems arise, the international community turns to the United Nations to provide a framework for resolving those issues. The United Nations is doing essential work in coordinating efforts to fight terrorism, promote global health, ensure respect for human rights, protect the environment for future generations, bring war criminals to justice, assist refugees, and so much more. Of course, no organization is perfect, and much work remains to be done. Today, you will hear a little bit about the 75-year history of the United Nations and why the United States should continue to maintain a positive working relationship with the United Nations to build a more peaceful and prosperous future that we all want to see. Thank you. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Elaine Jerkowski to introduce any special guests that we may have.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Elaine Jerkowski, and I serve as the Vice President for the Southern Illinois UNA chapter. We want to welcome you today in celebration of our UN 75th anniversary and are very honored to have some special guests here to join us today. Carbondale Mayor Mike Henry, we welcome you and we thank you for signing a proclamation to recognize the UN's 75th anniversary. Chancellor Austin Lane from Southern Illinois University Carbondale, we thank you for joining us today and for your support to our organization. We also want to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the Carbondale branch of the American Association of University Women, and Dr. Ella Lacey as its president, as well as the RSO, UNA Association Campus Chapter at Southern Illinois University, and its president, Patrick Murphy. We have a very interesting and exciting program today, and so I'm going to turn it over now to Olga Widener and let her share an introduction for our guest speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Jerkowski. I serve as advocacy chair for our chapter. And first of all, a happy birthday, UN at 75. I'm honored to introduce to you our keynote speaker at this UN virtual event celebrating the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. The organization and its specialized agencies have made tremendous strides in the areas of health, national independence, and human rights, to mention just those three. If we were not in a pandemic, we would have had a UN Day flag ceremony at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the UN. We would have arranged for our speaker to visit us in person and meet with students of our UNA campus chapter, which is newly formed and very active, and our model UN students. The venue would have been the student auditorium on our beautiful campus of SIU, and followed with a reception immediately after in honor of our speaker. However, this is a most unusual year. We are connecting worldwide, virtually, with all of you, and we're happy we can do that. And with our speaker, who is actually in London. Ms. Natalie Samarasinghe is the Chief of Strategy in the Office of the Special Advisor on the preparations for the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations 2020. She opened this year's United Nations Summer Academy. She has had the challenge of serving as Executive Director of the UNA UK, where she has worked since 2006. She's the first woman to hold this role. In this capacity, Natalie works closely with UNA USA Board of Trustees on the association's strategy and policy positioning. She's here to present the future we want, the UN we need. The presenter has asked that we show a short video before she speaks. She will have our undivided attention thereafter. A warm welcome, Ms. Samarasinghe.
Our world is facing unprecedented challenges. Climate change is altering natural balance. And our precious wildlife is struggling to survive. We are battling a new era of conflict and violence. There's the disruptive impact from digital technologies and shifting demographics with gaping inequalities. Now, a global epidemic is reshaping our world as we know it. We are at a crossroad at a time when our world seems so divided. Our world is struggling to breathe. For the United Nations 75th anniversary, we set out to ask the world, what are your hopes for your future?
If you could choose one thing to say to the UN, to world leaders about the future, what would that be?
In January 2020, the United Nations launched a global initiative to have the world's largest conversation on the future we want. Discussions have taken place in all settings, from classrooms to boardrooms, parliaments to village halls across the world, in order to reach as many people as possible. The United Nations listened, and the world spoke.
Justice, equality, and freedom for all.
People can really be in peace and with dignity, because our dignity was taken away from us because of our religion and because of who we are. And I hope that we are the last community who are suffering of those problems.
Health is often looked at as an expense. It is not. It is an investment.
We change by exchanging without losing ourselves.
We have run out of excuses and we are running out of time.
If we don't stop the destruction of our natural world, nothing else will matter.
More than ever before, we need solidarity, hope, and the political will to see this crisis through together.
From what we have heard, the world is not as divided as we thought. The global economy, healthcare, sanitation, education, and the hardest places hit are our top priorities from recovering from the pandemic. In response to COVID-19, greater international solidarity is urgently needed. The threat of climate change and destruction of our natural environment is the biggest fear for the future. We need increased efforts to reduce conflict and violence, and we aspire to further protect human rights. For optimism about our future, we need to look to our young people. The overwhelming majority of us believe global cooperation is more vital than ever.
Every time we fail to find solutions to global challenges, the most vulnerable people in our societies are hit the hardest.
Throughout history, we have accomplished unimaginable things, propelling each generation further than the last. There is no limit to the amount of good we can achieve together to make this world, our world, a better place. The challenges before us are universal, and we know that these challenges demand global solutions. We have the blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. The Sustainable Development Goals. In 2045, the United Nations 100th year, let's see the change we have implemented today that will shine a light on our children's tomorrow.
Change is coming. The real power belongs to the people.
And I want to turn the question inside out as well. I will not ask, how dare you? Instead, I will ask, do you dare to?
This is the most urgent of times and the most urgent of messages. Now must be our moment for action.
Good afternoon. Happy UN Day, and thanks so much, to Olga for this kind invitation, to the whole committee for the warm welcome, albeit virtual, that I've had, and for this opportunity to address the Southern Illinois chapter of the United Nations Association. As Olga mentioned, today is a bit of a homecoming for me, as I've spent quite a large chunk of my career at UNA UK. I've actually just come from their UN Day event, also virtual. So I clicked a couple of buttons to join this one. I'll be going off to another one, also run by UNA. And what's really struck me just over the course of the day is that UNAs around the world really come in all shapes and sizes. Some of them focus much more on campaigning, some more on education or Model UN. There are UNAs in Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America that really work on the ground with the UN agencies to deliver projects. I mean, they're the ones who build schools, who help with immunization. Other UNAs, for example, those in East Asia, they really focus on issues in the region, building solidarity, and so on. We were talking a little bit before about the difficulties amongst UNAs in the Middle East, really, in managing to travel, managing to bridge the gaps. But I think all UNAs share one goal, which is to bring people closer to the United Nations. And our movement has never been more important, never been more urgent as it is now at a time of such deep challenge, of polarization, and of distance, and not just physical, but I think in terms of the emotional disconnect between people and institutions. So what you do as a chapter on campus with your partners really is essential. It really does matter. We need to raise awareness of the threats we face globally. We need to foster global solidarity, but also local action. It's that combination that we need if we are to survive, quite frankly, as a species. So today I'm going to say a few words about the 75th anniversary of the UN. The film that you just saw, which was played and premiered at the General Assembly's official commemoration of the anniversary last month, set it up a little bit. But I'd like to talk in a bit more detail about what we did this year, which was launch a global conversation, to which UNA USA I know made a huge contribution, to really understand people's hopes and fears at this challenging time, and also their solutions for moving forward. I'm going to end with a few thoughts on the UN's plans for looking at really how can we recover from this pandemic and recover better. And how do we create the future we want and the UN we need to deliver that. That was the theme of this anniversary, and it's really been at the heart of our debates this year. So let me start with a few reflections on the anniversary. 75 years ago, world leaders, I think, did something extraordinary when they created the United Nations. It was born from the ashes of war, and it's often, I think, romanticized as a product of global idealism. And in some senses it was. It represented the hopes of war-weary populations for a better future. But it was also at the same time a very pragmatic and hard-nosed response. I mean, let's not forget, world leaders, they were wartime leaders. And I think they came to the recognition that the welfare of their citizens was better secured through cooperation and compromise than through rivalry and war. They made a calculation that working together was actually ultimately in their national interest. What led to that realization was unprecedented global pain and suffering. The horrors of the Holocaust, atomic bombs, millions dead. And you have to ask yourself, what will it take today for us to rekindle that spirit? We have a global health emergency. We have the existential risks of climate change, nuclear weapons. We're seeing geopolitical tensions rise across the world, deepening inequalities, changes in the makeup of our populations, huge shifts in the digital sphere that policymakers can't really keep up with. Even before COVID-19 turned our lives upside down, and I do hope that maybe next year there will be some chance for us to do this again in person. But even before the situation, for all those reasons I mentioned before, all those challenges, the United Nations really did not want to treat this as a big birthday party. My job was not organize a big party, celebrate our achievements, etc. Instead, Antonio Guterres, our Secretary General, was really keen for us to focus on what he saw as the big challenges, some of which I've mentioned already: climate crisis, the tensions between big states, the dark sides of new technology. Technology will bring us lots of benefits and open up lots of opportunities as well, but there are risks that we need to manage. And popular discontent. And I find it very revealing that when he speaks, he puts public discontent at the same level with these other challenges. He clearly sees that the fact that we feel less connected and we're less likely to trust our leaders, our governments, our institutions, is a huge risk to our future. And he wanted the UN75 anniversary campaign to really try and understand why. And to do that, he wanted us to listen to the people we serve and talk to them. What are your expectations for the future? Do you think your children will be better off or worse off? If you're a young person, what do you think your life will be like? What will work be like for you in 25 years? What will it be like to have a family? Will you be able to, marry who you want? All these sorts of questions. And also what people's expectations really are for the UN as an institution. Do you know it? Do you know what it does? Do you want it to deliver anything for you? So we were tasked, no small task, we were basically told, go forth and organize the world's largest conversation. And, our vision was really to try and do that, obviously, in person. So we had plans to foster discussions in classrooms, lecture halls, boardrooms, parliaments, community centers, village halls. And we hoped that through these discussions, people would find and rebuild trust within their communities, that it would bring different people together, and that it would inspire some action. Now, I mean, we got off to a good start, then the pandemic started, and it made our work a lot more challenging. But I think it also made it more urgent. The pandemic really has exposed the fact that it's not just our health systems that are fragile, but all of our societies and economies. But it's also underscored how interconnected we are and how critical it is for us to work together. So what we did through our initiative was we tried to reimagine a global conversation in this context. And what we did was, of course, we moved some things online, but we also didn't want to leave out the sort of nearly half the world's population that does not have internet access. And the event I just came from, one of our speakers, it's called Nisrin Elsam, and she's a brilliant Sudanese climate change activist who's actually part of the UN Secretary General's Climate Advisory Group. And she's there, holding out a mobile phone, desperately trying to get a signal. And there was a blackout as well. So she was basically speaking to us on her phone with a torch. And it just really brought home to me, I complain all the time about my internet not working properly, how important it is. So we tried to move some of the conversation online, but we also looked at other things. So, almost everyone does have a mobile phone. We used SMS technology. We actually called people where we could in a social distance way. We went out on the ground through partners to engage people. And we really wanted to do that because we thought, this is the moment now for us to have this sort of collective reimagining of our future. And we wanted also to give everyone the opportunity to have their say, because the sort of plans that are being made now, all the money that's being spent on recovering from this pandemic will really shape our lives for a long time to come. So we wanted to make sure that everyone, particularly the young, particularly marginalized voices, had a say. And I'm very proud that, as of today, we have over 1.2 million people from all countries and all walks of life who took part in our initiative. Tens of thousands have taken part in UN75 dialogues. We've also worked with 2 research companies to basically make sure we weren't just preaching to the converted. So we didn't want to sort of say, oh, the UN says have a conversation, that it's the usual suspects. So we did some representative sampling of 50,000 people in 50 countries that were broadly, reflect the global population, just to make sure we had a bit of a reality check. And we also looked at print, broadcast, online and social media in 70 countries to get a sense of what people say, what do they talk about when they're not being asked a question by the UN. And then we also looked at some academic research in the most, in the top sort of journals in each of the UN's languages. So we looked at Arabic, French, English, of course, Spanish, Russian, and Chinese, and really looked at what are the expert insights as well. And together, that's how we made our global conversation. And we think that that initiative really represents the UN's most ambitious attempt to crowdsource priorities for the future, to crowdsource insights and solutions to the challenges we face. And I think in a world that can feel very polarized, one of the most striking findings really to emerge was just how much we have in common. Amidst this current crisis, the immediate priority for most people, whether they were in rich countries or developing countries, whatever region of the world, was access to basic services. People talked about healthcare, education, safe water and sanitation, technology. But I think they also sort of moved beyond the immediate need. So the second priority, after these sort of basic services, was always to do with inequalities. And they expressed it in different ways. I mean, sometimes they said, let's support those hardest hit. Other times they actually said we should be, tackling poverty and inequality in a more systematic way. And there was also a strong call as part of that for greater solidarity. So, however low income the country was, there was always a sense that there was someone else who needed to be helped as well, and that those people should be prioritized. And I found that, it might not be the most unique new finding, but I just found that incredibly moving at this time. Looking to the future, the overwhelming concern that emerged, and again, this is across all regions, all ages, and all social groups, is, our inability to deal with the climate crisis and destruction of the natural environment. And again, I found this really fascinating, given that, we started doing this in January. And then you think of how the pandemic starts taking, spreading, taking hold, hitting different parts of the world at different times. But climate never changed from being the top priority. So health moved up the ranks very quickly. And in some regions, it's, I think in most now is number 2, but it never caught up with climate, which also surged. Again, I find it quite remarkable. And then depending on where you were in the world, the other priorities were human rights, conflict, corruption, poverty. And the other major finding was, again, we were relieved. I mean, we asked questions, do you think global cooperation matters? Do you think the UN matters? And we were kind of scared, thinking, what if everyone just says, no, actually, in these times, it really is about looking after our own, and so on. But again, across every single social group, there was overwhelming support for global cooperation, not just as something that's nice to have when times are good, or something that's desirable or important, but something that is vital to addressing the challenges we face. So, we talk a lot about sometimes populism being very popular, but it seems like global cooperation is pretty popular too. I mean, it was 87% of those polled, including in our sample. And I think what also surprised me is people are thinking big. Sometimes when times are tough, maybe the reaction I would have, envisaged is people just want to get through to the next day. But people were talking in big terms. I mean, they were thinking, the global economy needs to be transformed. There should be discussions about universal basic income, affordable access to technology. In some locations, they talked about fossil fuel subsidies ending, etc. So there was this huge sort of clamor for big ideas at this time and for transformational change. And I think the one demand that emerged most strongly from all regions was inclusion. People want a meaningful say in the decisions that will affect their lives, and they also want a role in how the programs, the services, that affect their lives are discharged. And that came particularly strong from youth and from civil society, and that includes the UN. So people were supportive of global cooperation, but they were not uncritical. They want cooperation that's more effective, that's more inclusive, that's more accountable, that's more transparent, and that includes changes they wanted at the UN. I started this talk by, I think I wished you happy UN Day, and then said, we didn't want to treat this as a celebration. But I should, it would be remiss of me not to mention some of our achievements. And Cindy set it up very well in her introduction. I do want to take a moment to reflect on the fact that 75 years ago, about a third of the world's populations were not citizens, they were subjects. They were still part of colonies. And since then, one of the biggest, I think, achievements of the UN has been helping these countries transition, for the most part, peacefully to independence. 75 years ago, there were only a couple of dozen or so countries that had fully equal voting rights for women. Today, it's really all but one UN member state that it does not have that. 75 years ago, smallpox was one of the world's deadliest diseases. Today, it's been eradicated, thanks to the World Health Organization and the sustained political and financial support it's received from member states. And I think you work with Rotary. I mean, Rotary has been absolutely instrumental in supporting the UN's fight against polio. And we are on the brink of eradicating polio too. And we've seen great strides forward in education, literacy, and poverty eradication, etc. But there have been many failures. I mean, I'm not here, obviously, to give you the glossy, advertising campaign. We've said never again too many times after tragic wars. Too many of us have been left behind, left out of this progress. So many people still contend every day with violence, discrimination, and deprivation. And many have seen their fortunes worsen as others have profited. So, these are long-standing challenges, and we have in the Sustainable Development Goals, sort of 17 goals that are really, I think, a blueprint for the future and that remain a great roadmap for us as we try to recover from the pandemic. But we have to remember that these goals were basically off track before COVID hit. We're looking at before COVID, a world in which 1 in 3 people do not have access to safe drinking water, in which over half the global population didn't have proper sanitation services. Not a single biodiversity target that was adopted at a UN conference 10 years ago has been achieved. And that's a real concern because 60% of all known diseases pass from animals to humans. And now this year, because of COVID, we're seeing the first rise in global poverty in over 2 decades. Global hunger is increasing. In South America, now we have about just over 17 million people who are severely food insecure, compared with 4.5 million just 7 months ago. That's a huge increase. So this really for us has to be a turning point. Our aspiration can't be to return to how things were before, to normal, because normal just wasn't working for many, many people. We have to build forward and build on people's hopes. And I think we need to build up those who have been hardest hit and who are most in need. But there is a good side, there is some good news here too. I mean, one thing the pandemic has shown is that huge transformations are possible to how we work, how we live. Vast sums of money can be deployed very quickly if political will is aligned with public support. So we have an opportunity to turn this crisis into something that puts us on a better path to a safer, fair, and more sustainable future. And that path, in a way, as I hinted before, exists. We have these 17 goals. They were adopted by all countries. They're designed to address the fragilities that the pandemic has exposed. But what we need now is an increased ambition to deliver them. So our Secretary General has called on countries to think about really changing the way governments interact with their citizens, really putting the most vulnerable first, promoting sustainable growth, green jobs, making the bailouts of certain industries conditional on aligning with the goals. And at the international level, he really, I think, hopes that there will be some sort of a global deal that really puts people and planet above profit. This is not something the UN has any power to impose in any way at all. This is all about the Secretary General trying to just galvanize, bring leaders together and say, we need to work this out together. And he's also basically called on the UN to do better, to become more networked, more inclusive, to draw on the capacities of civil society, youth, business, philanthropy, cities, regions, academic institutions. Because we've seen that we really need a whole of society response to these issues. It can't be something that's only led by governments, and certainly not by the UN. It's always, it has to come at the national and the local level. I think if we are to get there, it'll require that same combination of vision and idealism and pragmatism that the founders of the UN displayed 75 years ago. And despite, what we read about, despite the perceived tensions between countries, there is some hope there. I mean, last month we saw all countries unite in the General Assembly to adopt a declaration for the anniversary that basically committed them to listening, listening to what people said in our consultation and to taking action. And they've tasked the Secretary General now with coming up with a plan to put to them for decision on how to take this forward. And I think our role within the UNA movement and just as ordinary citizens is to, really hold our government to those commitments, and just make the case that today our world is so interconnected. We can't just say what matters over there doesn't affect us, because it does. It affects our health, our lives, our jobs. And the line between what is a national interest and in the international interest is really disappearing. Solidarity today is self-interest. It's not an easy message always, but it is a very important one. So 2020, I mean, this year is not going to be remembered for being the UN 75th anniversary. We'd hoped it would be, but we're under no illusion that it will be. But we are still hopeful that if we take the right decisions, if we stand together and we act now, it could still become the year when we turn things around and really embark on this journey to the better future for all that clearly everyone around the world so deeply desires. So thank you. I'll leave it at that. I'd love to take any questions and comments, but thank you again for doing what you do every day.
Thank you so much for that very thoughtful and provocative discussion. It makes us think about what we must, about the direction that we really should take as far as the UN goes. We have a few questions that have come from the audience, and if anybody in the audience would like to pose a question, we have a Q&A box or a chat box. Either are available for questions, but I have a couple that have emerged thus far. The first one is, UN issues are covered only briefly in local newspapers. We need a vehicle for educating the public about UN issues. Could there be a daily news app like What's Up with the UN for smartphones to download? What's your thought on that?
I mean, I think the publicity problem is huge, and we're really aware of that. So when we did our big media study, we looked at how global issues are covered in 70 countries. And I think disproportionately we found, everyone reports on conflict. So that's always the number one thing. But if you look at within the coverage of international conflict, how many articles actually talk about the UN? 2%.
Wow.
You look at, a challenge such as even COVID, even with the WHO front and center, it's about 7%. So, it's just people in reporting do not cover that angle at all. So it is a huge challenge, and we looked at some local and national papers. So I don't think it's a local paper issue at all. I think it's everywhere. So we try. I mean, we have some apps. We have a presence on social media, but I think the problem with those is we don't interact enough. They don't offer that same level of interaction that you can have with other sources. So it tends to be quite static. It's not very responsive to comments. I think the most successful app we've ever had was on WhatsApp. The WHO had this little thing where you could kind of type in a few numbers, get local information, get the latest stats, get some advice. I mean, and that was so popular. And I really wish we would do that a lot more, because otherwise the UN is always filtered through some other medium when actually people should be able to, access that information directly. We should be able to talk to you directly. I mean, I work at the UN. I can't navigate the UN's website because it's just huge. And if you don't know where things are, you're never going to find it. So it is a big thing. We have a fantastic new head of communications who's only joined us, a few months ago in the summer. And I really think that she will, transform us. She's very good at doing podcasts. She goes a lot on local radio as well. She's very personable. So I'm hopeful, but it is a huge challenge. But I mean, I think really also what can be done through, whether that's through, comments or blogs or, old-fashioned letters, etc., to raise awareness and highlight those angles when you see issues where there's clearly a UN angle. I think that can help, because one of the last, and I'll end with this, one of the last things our survey found was also when it comes to trust, people trust their peers so much more than they trust anyone else. So if we tell you something or you read it in a paper, people are less likely to believe it, take it in, share it, than if something comes to them by a friend. So, we need a kind of viral movement for the UN in that sense as well.
Very interesting. Okay. We have a few other questions. And a second question is, any ideas about what people can do locally to advance the UN goals?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think that's... sorry, did you want me to answer another question?
Go ahead.
as
Yes,
well?
yes.
Oh,
yes.
Yeah, so I think, that in a way that really needs to be determined locally. I mean, the Sustainable Development Goals are really broad. They cover everything from poverty to hunger to gender equality, human rights, cities, transport, etc. So I think it's almost, everything that you would do in your community to make it, greener or cleaner, more inclusive, etc., is basically already a contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. So the sorts of things we've seen are, great initiatives on food waste. So partnerships with local businesses to make sure that there's information about food waste, that food is sent to those who need it and not just thrown away. There's a wonderful initiative in the UK. It's a partnership with all the major supermarkets, especially, as we've been in lockdown for so long. I mean, we're out of it now. I'm sure we're going to go back into lockdown as a country in the not too distant future. There was real pressure there as people couldn't go out as well to make sure we weren't wasting things. So I think that's, one of the best projects I've seen. Lots of green energy projects. One of the ones that really inspired me was a partnership with an NGO called Barefoot, where they taught women in rural India who had a really tough time just getting electricity, how to make lamps with local parts. And then they had, they were able to bring these women together to teach women in other parts of the world how to do that. Even though they didn't necessarily speak their language, they were all, they understood. So there's just so many different actions. I think it just depends what it has to resonate with your community. I think that's the important thing. And you're probably already doing a ton of things that are effectively advancing the Sustainable Development Goals, because ultimately I think the goals just make common sense. They're just sensible things that we would do to improve our lives.
Okay, thank you. So the next part of that, where you touched upon it, what sorts of innovative projects have you seen other UNA chapters engaged in that help implement those goals? And you touched upon that to some degree. I'm just wondering if there's anything else that comes to mind.
Yeah, so like I said, I think the supermarket one is very, very replicable.
Mm-hmm.
I think also, just tying it with the previous question, I guess, also just setting up, local information services as well. And that's become also, again, kind of hugely important. I've seen, because of the situation we're in, where people aren't able to maybe go out and, get news or just meet friends in the way that they would do. You are kind of really stuck to your phone, your screens, and reliant on that, and really kind of using those tools to provide some locally relevant information. One little thing that we used to do at UNA UK, that's less relevant to you, but it's a small example, is when the UN puts out information, it's often really generic. So we would work, we'd do little things like, instead of dollars, we'd say what the money equivalent was in pounds, and already it feels a little bit more, relatable to people, or put a local spin on things. So a lot of our chapters would say, the UN's just, adopted this declaration on biodiversity, and we've been struggling here because we've been, there's this local species of bat or whatever it is that, is going extinct. So it's just sort of putting a local spin on things, making it a little bit more relevant. I think that could be a great answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to switch gears and talk about communications. So how does the ITU, which is the UN telecommunications arm, help the UN and all UN member countries get the word out on the work of the UN and other cooperation?
So it's interesting because the ITU does a lot of different things, and it's not actually the main publicity arm of the UN. It's actually a lot about coordinating, telephone networks. I think somebody mentioned this, between countries. So you can actually pick up the phone and talk to someone in another country, and it works. They also do a lot of work now on the digital space. So a lot of their work at the moment is really dealing with difficult issues around to what extent can you protect people when they go online? without infringing on people's rights to be there, to access information, to exercise free speech. So the communication side of things is one of its role, but that's actually a role that's supposed to be shared by every single UN agency. So every UN agency and body will have a communications team that's supposed to do that work. It's not always the best funded. In fact, it's mostly isn't, because as you can imagine, states would much rather the UN agencies do the work than talk about it. And that becomes an issue then when you're trying to explain your role and get political support, or get funding. So the folks who really invest heavily are UNICEF, the Children's Agency, the Refugee Agency, the World Food Programme, because all their money comes from donations from the public and from governments. It's voluntary. But it is really, really tough. And I have to say that ITU, as the communications arm, probably has the worst, I hope colleagues are listening in, but it has, I think they'd probably agree, it has one of the websites most in need of upgrading, I think, of any at the UN. And that just shows you that it's just within the broad framework and everything else they do, that's just not, I think, one of the priority issues. But the work they do, especially on the digital side at the moment, is hugely, hugely vital.
Okay, thank you. I have another question, and once again, we're going to shift gears. What is your thoughts on a national scholarship contest for college-bound students to generate goals or action for the future we want and the UN we need? So what if national scholarship contest help promote that vision and awareness? What are your thoughts on that? A national.
That's a fantastic idea. I mean, if every country did that, I think firstly, we get some great ideas. And then I think the engagement would be huge. And then also, what would people get as part of that scholarship? I think it would be fantastic to be able to bring in new voices, new faces at the UN as well. Something that's always surprising to me is it's hard. It's hard to get in. Our internships are unfortunately not paid. That is something that governments just, again, will not fund. I think there are real moves now within the system to how can we fund more people, but it does mean that people tend to join later in life. And I think that, the UN suffers as a result. We should be bringing in talent a lot earlier. And I think anything that helps us crowdsource ideas would be absolutely wonderful. You should pitch that to UNA USA, and then maybe we can get the UNA movement involved.
All right, thank you. Well, that is all I have for questions this afternoon. Thank you so much.
My absolute pleasure.
Oh, wait, maybe we have one more that just showed up. Oh, do you have any recommendations for how students interested in getting involved with the UN should plan their courses and club activities?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, there's so much you can do that really you can be motivated by what interests you. But I think if you really want to work closely with the UN, one thing to keep an eye on is what are the major conferences coming up, and can you engage with that sort of thematically? So that could be on climate change or biodiversity and human rights. We just had, quite a big one on women's rights. And there usually are opportunities. In fact, actually at the moment, there are more, I think, because of everything's online, to take part. So I think it's, if you're aligning your activities with something that's happening, you could also engage them with the UN process. And, that's, again, I think UNAUS is pretty good at connecting people in that regard. So I have to say, of all the speeches we heard from states and, all the bigwigs at the UN in September, I think the best speeches came from the 4 youth speakers that we had, who came because of their involvement, and then were able to take the floor in front of the world leaders and really make their case. And they did for climate, they did for inequalities, for women, etc. So I think, just keeping an eye out on what's happening and making sure you tailor whatever you do, whether that's, events or Model UN or, fundraising, or, I think that's a really great way. And then, I think also that kind of local action and angle is important. So I think there's two ways to get involved in the UN. Either you want to go and work with the, for the UN, in which case I'd strongly encourage you to do your research. There's so many agencies. It's really a question of what do you want to do and where do you think you can have the most impact. But I always say to people, you can really support the UN in whatever you do, whatever kind of job you do as well. And I think maybe some of the most innovative things I've seen happen at the campus level really managed to make the case for why this global institution matters to young people and kind of bridge the gap between this institution that can seem really far away, but actually has quite a big impact on our lives and what people are doing. So, I think looking at the UN's calendar, figuring out what are people interested in? Do they want to make a difference? Are they just interested in the issues? Do they just want to come, together and promote solidarity, etc.? It's really kind of what works for you. But I think you can, by keeping an eye out on what's going on, I think you can really kind of hopefully have an opportunity to engage directly with UN processes as well. And that's kind of what we were doing this year through the 75th anniversary. Those dialogues I mentioned, the surveys, the initiatives, that was a chance for everyone to have their say and have their voices heard. And it's not always the case. Sometimes you have these events and consultations and you think, okay, no one's going to listen. Well, we've kind of documented every response. You can see the results, in a report. We're going to have an interactive website soon. So you can really go to, what do people in Illinois, who are age 16 to 25 think on this issue? So you'll be able to do that very soon. So that would be, I guess, my last tip is there's still time to join in the UN75 global conversation. It does run till the end of the year. We'll be producing our final report in January. So that's one clear, easy way that you can get involved.
Oh, great. I have a few more questions that have surfaced since our last question. Given the many problems that were highlighted by the film you showed, what do you find personally that most inspires you about a hopefully positive future?
Yeah, it's tough sometimes, I think, when you're confronted with these issues to be hopeful. But I think what gives me hope is that for all the challenges that have been mentioned, we have also really seen people take action this year, whether that's, striking for climate change, whether that's helping in their communities, really addressing some of the inequalities, reaching out, all the stories of people looking after the vulnerable, the elderly, those with, pre-existing, conditions. I think that really has also, in many ways, COVID has brought out the best in so many of us. And also just the idea that we should be taking action for equal rights, Black Lives Matter movement. I think all of that has been really inspiring to think that people are actually, they care about those issues and are willing to do more than just, maybe click on a petition or whatever. They're actually going to go out and take some action. And I think that is inspiring because it shows that there is a movement out there. And we also have the data, as I said, to prove it. People care and people want to do things. So that is, I think, the biggest glimmer of hope. It's harnessing that, making sure that energy, that goodwill is channeled in a really positive direction, and that there is a plan for how we rebuild better and together after this. I think that will make all the difference. But I think the goodwill is there behind all these divisions and polarizations. I think when it comes down to it, people aren't very different, and people want to help others. I think that is we're social animals. I think that's a natural way for us to want to respond. It's just about tapping into that.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure if we have time for one more question. Okay, so the last question that I'm going to ask is from our audience as well. And the question is, how can the UN be cognizant of the dangers of any one UN member country using the new digital dangers to their own advantage? And I think they're referring to digital dangers as artificial intelligence and surveillance capitalism. So most small members may be completely unaware of these even as of now. So how can the UN be cognizant of the dangers of any one member country using these technologies to their advantage?
It's an excellent question. I mean, in terms of the actual threat of that happening, we're incredibly aware of that. So my team is split. So we have the 75th anniversary. We also have within our team a focus on digital issues. And, you know, we've seen that in many different ways. I mean, the UN is not immune to these kind of attacks. And you know, they've been perpetrated in different ways. So yes, on the surveillance side, on the hack side, I was involved with the sort of big women's conference last year, where there was sort of all sorts of digital harassment. So we're very cognizant of the threat in general. I think it's one of those issues where it's difficult for the UN because it's not actually even governments who are really in the driving seat sometimes with these developments. It's also relying on tech companies. And I think that's an area where the UN is still very kind of traditional and intergovernmental. And it's really trying to break into that space. In terms of how can it be aware of specific attacks by countries is very difficult. I mean, ultimately, the UN doesn't have any power to kind of investigate these issues. This is all about relying on country information. So I think it is a huge challenge and a huge area where there is a sort of digital strategy. It will take agreement by states that we can create the kind of infrastructure that can help protect, as you say, you know, whoever asked the question, really the smaller member states as well. But it is a big area for us, and it's one that if we don't get a grip on it, that's, you know, really that will make us less relevant in many ways, because it's an area that needs some global governance and it needs some sort of international norms and standards as well. So, you know, we are aware of it, and hopefully there'll be the political space to act.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over now to Olga for some closing comments.
Thank you, Natalie, for your inspiring message, which resonates, enabling us to reflect on the complex challenges facing our world and how active and committed we need to continue to be in the years ahead. The world is becoming more complex and interconnected and needs the UN as never before. Yesterday, ahead of the UN Day, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for peace and solidarity. That's a tremendous message. We need to continue to be actively engaged to create a better world by thinking locally and globally and acting locally. To celebrate the values enshrined in the UN Charter, signed by governments on behalf of we the people, our civil society salutes the aims of the UN as defined in the Charter, and will continue to work tirelessly for their achievement in the next 75 years ahead. The Earth is but one country, and mankind is citizens. Thank you all for your participation, our speaker, and the big thank you to the Public Library in Carbondale who's hosted this event for us, and everyone who helped to plan it. And please follow us on UNAUSA.org, and go also to the UN website, United Nations, UN.org, and get engaged. We welcome you. Thank you.